Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I am in Hong Kong. I am aware of that. I'm from as you heard, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And who's heard of us in a good way? And anybody in a bad way? Or I'm sensitive, so speak up. Well, we're part of the Department of Commerce. We're a small part of it, about 3,000 people altogether, 2,000 or so. We have 12 buildings, 2,000 PhDs, 4 or 5 combs, 2 ties. That's the complete inventory of NIST right there. We do things in chemistry and physics, as well as computer science, manufacturing. So we do lots of different things. We've even been fortunate to earn 3 Nobel Prizes in physics. My mother still thinks it's possible that I might get one too. She might have some Chinese in her somewhere back there. But today I'm going to talk on cloud computing, and I'm part of the Information Technology Lab. So first, forgive me if I start off with what I call my weasel slide, that anything I say that's not particularly intelligent is not NIST's fault. It's, but mainly to say I'm giving views and ideas about cloud computing and not really making policy. So today I'll talk a little bit about trustworthiness in the cloud. And forgive me, it's a little pedantic, but I just want to lay a little bit of groundwork of, why do we find it difficult to achieve security and trustworthiness in the cloud? Because it's complex, because it's difficult. I'll talk a tiny bit about the cloud definition. I'll recount something about what our present efforts are in cloud. I'll talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that we face. And then I'll conclude with some takeaways and recommendations of things I think people should look at. So what we mean by trustworthiness, and when we talk about it, we tend to think of things like it satisfies some set of requirements, some specification someone has written. Maybe it satisfies some kind of development process, something called the example here is capability maturity model, or it just seems to do the things I think it's supposed to do. When we look at it from the cloud perspective, we really don't have much opportunity to see the first 2 elements of that, right? So when we think about trustworthiness in the cloud, we definitely want confidence in the hardware, the software, and the bandwidth, our ability to get to the cloud. But generally, we only see it from that final version, that fit for purpose. And that puts us a little bit of a disadvantage in place to some of these ideas that Jim and others have talked about transparency in the cloud. So how do we break that down into meaning something? So, well, we might break down the idea of trustworthiness into, is it reliable, is it secure, is it timely? We might try to break it down even a little bit further, but it's still fairly intuitive. It's not a very scientific engineering kind of way. We often have a lot more ability to do it than we do to measure it or describe it. So we break it down a little bit further. Maybe we break reliability down to fault tolerance and testability. Maybe we break down timeless into availability and performance. Some of these components we can do well. We know about performance. We know about availability. We have an ability to describe those things well. But when you try to compose things and put them together and to compose a system of some kind, so you put some of these attributes together and you put 2 of these together, we can even make a pretty nice complicated looking set of equations, and we can have properties, but we basically have an expression, but we don't have much algebra to compose these kinds of things and to say meaningful things about it for several different reasons that I'll elaborate. But one of the primary ones is context. Security tends to be driven very much by context. I had somebody, I think Jim was talking about the OSI layer. When he did the OSI layer, those famous layers, that was, these were just the names of the committees. That's how it just sprang up. It wasn't, we'd like to think of it as a large scientific endeavor. But these were just the layers, or just the names of the committees involved. And one of the key players there told me once that, security is it's not really a perfectible attribute, it's a negotiation of interests. And so that idea of you have to negotiate the security into systems is an important point I'd like you to be able to take away with. So I talked about attributes and combining things. What does it mean when we try to do those things? What have you got? you could put a bunch of these things together. I could 3 of testability, 2 maintainability, 1 safety, and just a pinch of security. What is it you have when you compose those things together? So that's a very challenging thing to try to say something about the future of a system when we describe trustworthiness that way. So my key message for cloud, though, is that you can do a lot of those things, and that's important, but eventually you have to get to an operational context on a very dynamic system. And you have to think about the anticipated target environments that you're going to operate in. So let me just break that down a little bit further, and this is what I call my sort of Chinese acrobatic slide. Imagine many years ago, I think I was in Shanghai, and I went to the acrobatic circus, and I just imagine the security guy is out there, and he's out there, he's spinning a plate on top, right? Now he's spinning the policy plate there, and then somebody else comes along spinning attributes, threat space, environment, system, and software, all simultaneously at the same time. And you can imagine what it's like to then try to do security based upon that kind of a complex environment, especially where things can happen inside, where a policy action will ripple through that space, attributes through threat space. And all these operate somewhat independently. You know, you're not in control of what the threat space is and what people will want and what they try to do. You may not, and you as a customer won't necessarily, even if you're in a private cloud, you won't necessarily be able to discern all these activities well. What's the software, what's the system, environment, threat space, especially on the area of threat space and policies that come from on high, laws and other things impact us. So it's a challenging space. So I think I'll skip on this one because it's that idea. What do you have? You have some pretty fuzzy math when you try to say something scientifically about these things. Many of these attributes are not quantifiable. We can do reliability, availability, and performance, but the others we have real difficulty composing them and giving you some overall assessment. So let me skip ahead. First, a standard cloud presentation is you scare everybody first, right? And then you gently offer solutions. Don't worry, I don't have solutions. But so let me just talk just briefly about the cloud definition. Just a little history. People have seen this, but I'd like you to know just a little history of that is when Peter, Mel, and I did this, we didn't do this for anybody in the world. We just wrote it for ourselves. We just thought, what is this stuff about? Let's just try to describe it and say it in some reasonable fashion. We honestly didn't have an idea that it would. We just put it up on the website one day, and people started repeating it and using it. It wasn't a carefully planned, well thought out exercise. It was just us trying to explain it to ourselves with the view that we thought this was an important paradigm. And so let me give you another slide that sort of describes somewhat of the framework that's involved here. So, and I say this to think more towards the future. The issue is not what is cloud computing. The issue is what to do with it. What kind of business problems can we solve? What are the pain points that we can alleviate? And think about a world that went from maybe highly, first of all, no service, managed service, to a world of self-service. Think about a world in which we didn't have broad fundamental network access at high speeds. Now we have that. Inflexible workloads to elastic workloads. Non-shared resource to vast pooling of resources. And what cloud gives us is, and the reason the security conundrum here is that the power of cloud comes from that shared service, that ability to take the resource, funnel it together, use it efficiently, and release it for others to use. Well, that's, of course, that idea of sharing and using a resource, sharing and security, these are people that they live in different universes. They don't like to talk to each other very much. That's our challenge, is to retain the power of that shared resource while still providing these other attributes that we're looking for. So, and in terms of the thinking about the cloud, is of course not to think about them as just the cloud in particular, but think about the kind of deployment model you're interested in, what level of service layer you're at, and what are the most key essential characteristics for you. I must say this in terms of, I think for personal viewpoint is that I would hope to see a world where hybrid clouds are the future, where I can take my workload of any kind that I have and move it to any provider I would like, Whether I want to take it to public or private, I'd like to see a world in which that workload can go anywhere that I think is best for safety, for security, for price, whatever the reasons. So that's an objective I would charge people to kind of look towards. So against that backdrop, I wanted to give you just a few minutes about what are we trying to do at NIST in the cloud computing program. I'm not the program manager of that anymore, but my colleague Bob Bond is. So, but if you send me a note and have a question, I'll be sure and ship it off to him. So let's talk about some of the things we're trying to. What are we trying to do? Where are we trying to get the U.S. federal government to adopt cloud computing because it's efficient, because it assists in agility and innovation. And again, cost is important, but the ability to innovate and be agile, I think, is a more fundamental quality. Of course, there's an inextricable link between cost and agility. If you find people operating at 80–90% of their IT budget is to keep the lights on and operate what they're doing, there's not a lot of room to do innovative initiative and innovative kinds of things with that kind of resource allocation. So we're working a lot with standards bodies and our ubiquitous publications, and we are a pretty promiscuous lot. We talk to everyone in the world who would like to talk to us about cloud computing, and so we encourage people to give us feedback. So we work closely with the private sector and other stakeholders and the standards bodies in particular to try to put out the best kinds of products. Most of our ideas are around creating vocabularies to discuss the issues of cloud computing. Again, the definition was to move people away from what is it to how to best use it, and what are the conditions that would solve the kind of business and mission problems we all face. So we have, not important to see this other than to look at it later to say, we have periodic outreach to various entities and outreach periodic conferences where we tell people what we're trying to do. And the main way to probably see most of our work is through the publications that we process. So one of the publications is a technology roadmap where it talks about the requirements, and we've listed 10. There's always 10 magic requirements that we want people to take a look at. So let me just highlight a few of them. We obviously want to work with standards bodies. Standards bodies, of course, work at their own sort of pace, and that's in candidates by necessity. You don't always get the best solution. You get the agreed solution in standards environments. And of course, the world is there's lots of standards bodies trying to do this. Sometimes not always coherently and not always with the properly coordinated, but I think every entity, every major standards body in the world is trying to do something in the cloud computing environment. I'll highlight a few of them. Certainly work on more harmonized service level agreements so the terms and ambiguity becomes less, that we can be more share and reuse that. Things like architectural descriptions so that we can compare same things to same things. Define the gaps. Are there regulatory gaps? Are there technical gaps? What are the seeming solutions that seem to be available? And talk about future requirements in there. So we've described these things in a fairly lengthy publication. We encourage you to take a look at it. I think it's 500, 291, is that? 91, right. We've also written a reference architecture. I must confess it's a little challenging to write an architecture without talking about a specific technical company. But what it embodies is certain things like business use cases. If you want to speak to the private sector in a meaningful way, technical people will write technical use cases, files closed, objects opened, deleted, and things like that. But speaking to the private sector, you probably have to speak in demand terms. And one way to effectively do that is through business use cases. What are the dominant big business use cases? And in a sense, the revolution here is that IT is becoming a commodity. And you have to articulate things in commodity demand terms, I think, to really get change in the cloud vendor kind of world. So I'd urge people to think deeply about business use cases, how to aggregate them together and speak back to cloud vendors for tenders and the like. We also produce a standards roadmap which articulates the requirements, the challenges, the overview, what are the gaps in those things, who is doing what kind of work. We're also doing work in the the ecosystem of networking. In other words, there's huge demands and huge volumes of demands that occur. You know, how does that play out? Can we predict certain effects from these large movements of data, and are there issues and concerns there? And so we're working on some simulations to make some conjecture and predictions about effects from that. So everybody, of course, every government slide has a strategic program, right? The point of that is that, yes, there is strategy there, but there also have to be accompanying action plans. So for each one of those requirements, they've written some action plans. Now, to be of course, candid with you, not every one of these is going to be a winner, but some of them, we're going to publish them, let you see them, and others can pick up this work as well and take a look at it for how it might improve your efforts in this space. I talked about some of these already, so let me skip ahead from that. Service level agreements I talked about. Again, this idea of common references for service vendors. So one of the difficulties is people speak slightly different in each one of these ways. So can we come up with some common expressions, common use cases, common ways to think about this so that can be projected back to the vendor community? I think we'll get a better price. I think we'll get better, our needs satisfied better if we can do those kinds of things. Of course, there's also unique, generally government kinds of issues. In the U.S., there's something called 508, which means you know, things like for a disabled or a blind person needing to, you know, wanting to have some access to this, what kind of requirements are there and how to speak to that. There's also notions of discovery and legal proceedings where you have to get information, record retention, how long do you have to keep these things. He's very mundane sounding, but rather crucial if you're operating a government institution of some kind, that you describe those things. Compliance requirements we know are challenging, but I actually have somewhat hope on compliance because, you know, the top level words will change, right? You know, but I'm pretty sure in Mandarin, in French, and English that authentication is the same thing, right? So the top level words will change, right, of what people mean and what they say, but at least underlying them, the technical things are the same. And as time has evolved, there's been much more harmonization of what happens. Even the major divergences between, say, Microsoft and the open source world, these are still coalescing in terms of how they really do certain things. So I think there's actually some hope there, but these are very important matters, though not terribly interesting ones to actually do them. The point I'm just trying to stress on this particular slide is that we have a number of activities there. You see on the left-hand side a certain number of publications. We encourage people to read them, and if we have a draft up there, please do comment on them. If you want more information on the cloud effort itself, here are some links and information. And so I encourage you to talk to me after this. I'm not quite done, so don't leave your seats right away here. Now, let me tell you forgive me, not a good segue, but before I give you some of the recommendations and issues involved with cloud computing, just a cautionary note. It's that when I said these other issues about what are technical and questions about security in this space, look, security concerns are eternal. They exist on all complex. If there was no cloud, we'd have the same questions. We'd still be talking about multi-tenancy, even if there wasn't cloud. We have multi-tenancy everywhere. So some of these issues are just, some of it is just resistance to an era of change and what it means. Many of them, but still there is truth in issues in each one of those. But regardless of whether it's cloud or not cloud, these issues exist. It exists at every service layer, at every deployment model, and with every vendor. However, I want to say this, that it's crucial for innovation and agility and efficiency. We can't operate data centers at 10 or 15% efficiency and survive. Nobody can afford that, least of all the US government. We probably have done consolidated hundreds and hundreds of data centers across the government, and we'll keep doing that because we can use virtualization and cloud to kind of do those things. I think every deployment model that I'll talk about here are viable choices, including cloud computing. Inherently, it's a business decision which one you use. Another cold-hearted business decision we've made for thousands of years. And that's what we have to do, is think of this as a business question and the set of priorities and issues and deal with them as we do other complex decisions. Of course, it is a balancing act for what cloud provides here. That's probably my boss. You said something wrong, yeah. So it's a balancing act. There's potential improvements, many potential improvements. The ability to specialize, to provide more focused skills. Yes, there is, people have said small to medium enterprises, small businesses are toast. Okay, you just can't, not possible. And even most enterprises, even large enterprises, are going to be challenged just because of their size and complexity and the human need to communicate across countries and landscapes. It's still going to be challenging. There is a potential to have stronger platforms because of the homogeneous nature of the cloud provider. Obviously, no one can match them resource availability-wise. It's almost impossible. I shouldn't say it's impossible. Somebody will do it tomorrow. But to DDoS, denial of service of a major cloud entity like an Amazon to me is just almost, they have so much capacity. It's not unlimited, by the way, but they have so much capacity to deal with it better than you possibly can. Their ability to deploy resources faster and more agile than you is pretty obvious. Of course, in backup and recover, it's no longer the need to build another monster data center just to back up the other one, right? But there are concerns, and the fundamental concern is usually one of complexity, which is the fertile ground of insecurity, is complexity. Yes, it is a shared multi-tenant environment. We have to keep Coke separate from Pepsi, right? We have to keep them apart. The strength, and this is all logical separation, because it's not really cloud computing if it was all physical, right? So, but again, that power comes from multi-tenancy, so as well as the peril comes with that. You are facing the bad old internet, right? And you do have a loss of control, but like most outsourcing decisions you're making, you're losing, hopefully you're giving something up but getting something more back if you're savvy about it. I talked about, there's another way of viewing it, yes, complexity. The attack surface, proprietary interfaces, nesting of services. If I'm using Amazon in the US, if I'm using Netflix in the US, I'm probably living on Amazon somewhere. And so if I'm using some other small SaaS application, I'm living on someone else's infrastructure. There's a nesting of services and a nesting of dependability between these various players. And with these large ecosystem plays where many small parties are providing support around something, like FedEx has a little pool of people that contribute to that process with them. And so you're depending on a big ecosystem and it has to work. You are facing the internet with all the usual issues that arise from that. I've talked about multi-tenancy. And of course, the loss of control. You don't have that visibility. You don't have the insider access. You don't, I can't dynamically reallocate the resource without moving location. It's not really a part of that. I probably can't technically prove to you the information is 100% gone because little tidbits of information are in various places. Probably technically not feasible to do it. Incident response, of course, is intricate in that space because who did it, where did it come from, what happened. So there are many challenges. I said that's one administrative authority can give you more consistency. You have defense in depth. You certainly have scalability. Yes, but again, all the other eternal issues exist. Key management was pretty ugly before. It's still ugly. It'll be ugly in the years ahead. One thing I will emphasize again is network dependence. You are depending on the network. Cloud provider is not responsible for your network access, but you are depending on a well-functioning access to the network and getting you there. You are dependent on that browser and APIs, and browsers are supremely complex all by themselves. And compliance, of course, as I said, is a variety challenge. So it comes down a lot to control. Software as a service, less control, I should say, because you're buying into that application with more control at the infrastructure level because it's a lot like your data center. So my key takeaways is that cloud's not a single system. Don't think of it as the cloud. Think of it as a spectrum of architectures, underlying technologies, configurations, business models, service models, and deployment models. So it's a set of these things. Think about it as trying to solve pain points and problems, and what's the best way to solve it, as opposed to thinking the cloud is this disambiguated body of things. Again, in general, with IaaS, infrastructure service sounds more familiar to us because it's a lot like our existing data centers. But I believe as we move ahead and forward, we'll move to a much more, we'll do a fair amount of platform, and we'll ultimately, I believe, move towards the SaaS world, where specialized services. Then those will get complex. It's like in federation. Eventually it gets too big and you got to refederate again. So I think there'll be a cycle of things, but I see us moving towards a more SaaS kind of world ultimately. In cloud, we share the fate of the others, so which is why we have to act together with folks like the Cloud Security Alliance and my own organization and others to do this well. I talked about uniform management practices holding some way. Again, it's a commodity, and so some of our interactions will have to be commoditized. I talked about browsers and those issues as well, and that. So again, I'm sorry if I say this 10 times, because the one thing you go away with, it's a business decision. So you have to bring all those skills to bear on that. It's more than just cost, it's business, right? Logical isolation of those workloads should also be evaluated. How can I describe that? How strong does it have to be? Service agreements, of course, are rather tortuous and different. Lots of lawyers involved. The expression of usage of this is very different from the common use of those terms. Understand the limits of the remedies in terms of service. Usually it's we give you your money back, which is really not the issue most of the time. It's keeping my brand, my reputation protected, keeping me operating. That's what's important to me, not the money itself. And of course, if you're, again, looking at those terms of service, what are the provisions and limitations? How do they handle compliance and criticality and backup? How do I get my data back if I want it back? How fast do I get it back? What happens, how fast does it disappear if I don't pay you? Think also about your legacy apps. Remember, this is a large way an architectural decision. What are my apps? Apps don't magically become cloud aware. You have to rewrite some of them. Some of them you encapsulate in some virtualized fashion. Some you'll have to rewrite. Some you'll have to create. And thinking about moving there, and what are the cost and time frames involved. Don't think of the cloud as an all or nothing proposition. Think about what makes sense when, what makes more sense over the midterm to long term. All these deployment models, we depend on a network access cloud. Do not neglect that part of it. You still need IT skills. Your problems, it's not just like, okay, I don't have to worry about that, somebody else is doing that. You still need to know how to do these things. I do think people, especially in service economies, will be challenged. Folks in businesses, the CSCs and others of the world, these integrators, are going to have to figure out a different way to make a high-quality living, because it won't be, your mess for less, outsource it to me. It'll be people that know how to solve these things from a business issue, an architectural way of how they can help their clients move to that space. It won't be from running monster data centers. It won't be from getting rich from change orders or managing your workloads. Think of a world that's data and service oriented. I talked about multi-tenancy ad nauseum. I'll skip over that. Let me say something though about, think about it's usually cheaper to get to the cloud than it is to bring it back. So think about that. Think about the performance limitations that they express in there. So each of these service models and deployment models have a degree of scope and control which is that vary. But of course, we still remain responsible. We still have to be smart. We still have to talk with our colleagues, and again, working with our friends at CSA and other places. We still have to make sure that transparency is given, that we keep that accountability, because we really don't have any other choice. We're still responsible for these things, and that still remains with us. So with that, let me give you the standard laundry list of issues. Each one of these things people have to kind of think about, right? Don't forget your legal officials in this process. Play in the standards world. Even if you don't want to actively go to the meetings, monitor them. Think about how that affects your business and your enterprise, because not every thing out there in the cloud standards world is going to be good for you. Sometimes, different interests become involved. Think about how it affects you. Think about a portfolio of standards entities that you want to kind of watch and see how it affects your business. Think hard about your architecture where you are to where you want to be. Again, thinking this thing from a data and service point of view, less physical spaces, less configurations and data centers. Think about the service that's necessary, how I protect my data is more fundamental and powerful issues than physicality of this stuff. Compliance, again, a big issue, and service level agreements I talked about. So what's my recommendation? Okay, everybody should, I probably shouldn't even read that first bullet anymore. It's that business case, isn't it? Think about solving problems and finding pain points, creating opportunities. Note this intersection of these big currents of activities, the world of mobility and mobile apps. Mobile apps, just because, I say that BYOD causes BYOB. Bring your own device causes you to bring your own bottle to work every day. Think about these current and events, right? The world of mobile data and mobile devices. The problems, computer science, laws of computer science and software haven't been repealed just because it's on a small, cute device that has pretty pictures and cat videos on it. It's still software. It still has to be understood and properly used, right? This intersection of cloud and big data and social networking, these are very powerful currents. Think about where you play in that space. What are the niche points you want to work in? Think about, again, those architectural goals you have. I suggest thinking about a migration strategy. Don't forget to do that in both directions, how to get it there and maybe how to bring it back if you want to as well. Understand that, yes, there are legal questions, there are security questions, there are a host of technology questions, but you won't ever get there if you wait for any one of those to be solved. So, and don't think of it as an all or nothing proposition. Think about what makes sense when and where, given your architecture, given your mission, given the pain points you're looking to solve, and the opportunities, more importantly, you want to create. So with that, let me stop here and ask if anybody has any questions or comments. Okay. Was it that riveting, or was it that? Okay. Come on, one question. One. Jim, ask me a question, damn it.
What are you doing for dinner tonight?
I'm glad you offered to buy me dinner. Yes.
You discussed, you have told us there is a roadmap for the U.S. factory. Okay, thank you.
One question.
In the slides, you tell us there's a roadmap for cloud computing in the federal government.
Right.
Can you give us a more background of this roadmap, and is it begin with some specific bill or department, or it will be rolled in the
I would argue,
scale?
in fairness, it's not. Most of the time when we write publications, they're not very government-centric, right? We don't write them with these words of typical of a government document. We write them in very neutral terms. So I think any one of the requirements, things like service level agreements, standards bodies, those kinds of things they're written in very ordinary language about what's the requirement. And the requirements are not different. The computer isn't actually aware of where you are in terms of whether you're in Hong Kong or Singapore or Boston, Massachusetts. The requirements are the same, right? This is a huge international, it's one planet when it comes to cloud. And so I think the requirements are fairly accessible to anyone and describe the basic requirements that anybody would want to have, right? So, okay. Any more? There's a bonus point for 2. Yeah. Yes.
From the Commerce Department, right?
Yes.
So now in US we have Facebook, Google, Amazon, those big giants.
Uh-huh.
We have some big companies in
Right.
this field, okay?
Right.
So can you?
I have an answer for this already. Go ahead.
Can you put some thought or opinion whether the government should put a number no less than 10, let's say, for those companies operating in states. I'm referring to when the company is the number of companies too small. There may be a problem.
Oh, you're worried about the concentration,
Yeah, right.
the dominance that has. Well, you know, I use some words. I was telling somebody this earlier. There's they may remember who the founder of Netscape was, a guy named Mark Andreessen. And of course, his company was eventually overtaken by Microsoft. But he's a very thoughtful guy and a terrific venture capitalist as well. He said that around the world, people are dreaming of how to be the next Mark Zuckerberg, right? And what I think the cloud does is, I think he said, it gives them a shot at it. Because the difference is that that access to the cloud is universal, right? That everyone can, it's not so much having the big data center, it's being able to employ the cloud to do things. I think the world would change in the sense that you're going to find a lot of small entities, a lot of small 10, 15-person companies are going to do things that the giants can't do. Think about what happens in things like big data, right? Where people can do things. They have access, as an individual, as a small company, you have access to a level of resources that's unimaginable. In Silicon Valley, no one gives you money to solve a problem by, okay, first I want to do is I want to dig some dirt and put some concrete up and make a data center and hire some sysadmins and go to town. Nobody gives you money for that. They want you to, you live on the cloud first, and if you're going to do something there, I want you to either win or fail fast. I don't. And so being able to, if you're going to innovate, you have to tolerate failing fast. It's better to fail fast and don't spend all that money right away. So I think there's far more opportunity for that in that space for the small entity, the small player. I was talking about this earlier, that someone in, say, South America that is selling native artifacts, they have an ability to access a world market to sell their enterprise. eBay is a company, not the best innovator in the world these days, but think about them providing access to small businesses to sell things in a world market basis. That's a fabulous thing. So I think I'm trying to give a short answer for what was a long one, is that I think the opportunities are so much better because of that access to that resource anywhere in the world. And I don't think the big play is to be the monster one, because I think a company like an Amazon is not, they're not always going to be the cheapest vendor when it comes. They're the dominant public cloud vendor in the world, but they're not always going to be the cheapest one for someone to operate and use. So there's a economist named Schumpeter. Anybody? There's 10 bonus points for Schumpeter. He was an economist, and he said that technology, creative destruction. Certain things will be destroyed, and there will be opportunities that come about. But he said technology is, he also said technology is not kind. It does not ask, does not say please. That's our job, I think, as players in this space, to make sure it does play nice, that it does play fair, that particular world standards of proper non-monopolistic practices occur, and which is, believe me, the EU and others look hard at places like that. Okay, all right, one more.
Hi, can you talk a little bit about actual business use cases of the public cloud by American government agencies? I mean, what's impressed you so far? I mean, what government agency in terms of using the public cloud has impressed you so far?
Well, I don't know if I have a good example of an aspirational one that someone said. He's the gentleman, he used to be the CIO of NASA. He said that his objective with cloud was, I want every scientist that comes to work at NASA I want them to solve problems unconstrained by computing capacity and workload. I want them to solve problems feeling I have every bit of power and access to tools that I need to solve problems. And I think that's a powerful vision of what cloud can be. There's a host of things, housekeeping functions that people do, right? The time and attendance, travel, grant making, business things that have a cacophony of applications, and that a lot of that demand can be congealed and offered up for competition. And I think that's the role for government, is you're always going to, no matter the size of the government, if it's the size of, say, Singapore or the United States, departments and agencies will resist. It's the nature of the world, right? But we have to move again to congealing a lot of that demand into big chunkable amounts that can be offered up for tender or retained in-house if that's the more cost-effective route to take. But we can't operate thousands of data centers like this. It's too expensive, too much energy wasted, and we should really use the cloud to solve actual problems. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, again, for his in-depth view on both the government perspective as well as the enterprise perspective on the cloud solution. So I'll put our hands together for Tim again, for his in-depth view. Thank you, Tim. So coming up will be another speech from